On a cold morning in November 1978, a woman named Galina Mikhailovna Volkova walked into a KGB office in Leningrad and made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was 50 years old, a loyal Soviet citizen who had never once questioned the righteousness of the state, and she carried with her information about her son that she believed would save him. She had rehearsed what she would say during the sleepless night before. She told herself over and over that she was doing the right thing, that the system would be merciful, that her boy would be given a chance to redeem himself. She was wrong about all of it. Galina had lived her entire life within the confines of Soviet society, and she had never wanted anything else. She was born in a small village outside Novgorod and had grown up during the worst years of Stalin's reign. Her childhood had been marked by hunger, fear, and the constant presence of state propaganda that told her the suffering was temporary, that a glorious future awaited, that the party knew best. She had believed it then, and she believed it still. When she was 16, she had moved to Leningrad to work in a textile factory. She had met her husband, Pyotr, at a factory dance in 1948. He was a mechanic, a quiet man with steady hands and no interest in politics. They married in 1950, and their son Leonid was born in 1957. Pyotr had died suddenly in October 1977, collapsing at work from a heart attack at the age of 53. The loss had been devastating, but Galina had thrown herself into her routines with even greater intensity. She worked her shifts at the factory, attended party meetings, and kept the apartment spotless. She took pride in her membership in the factory's trade union committee, where she helped organize cultural activities and socialist competitions. She had always been the kind of person who followed rules, who believed that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded, who trusted that the Soviet Union was building something better than what had come before. Leonid, her only child, had always been a source of pride. He had been a good student, quiet and studious, and when he was accepted to Leningrad State University in the fall of 1976, Galina had felt vindicated in all the sacrifices she and Pyotr had made. Leonid was studying history, a respectable field that could lead to a teaching position, or perhaps work in a museum or archive. He lived at home to save money, commuting to campus each day on the tram, and for the first year and a half, everything had seemed normal. He attended his lectures, came home for dinner, and spent his evenings reading or working on essays. Galina had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong, but by early 1978, she began to notice small changes in her son's behavior. At first, they were so subtle that she dismissed them. Leonid started coming home later in the evenings, explaining that he had group study sessions or needed to use the university library. He became quieter, more withdrawn, spending long hours in his room with the door closed. When she asked him about his classes or his friends, his answers were brief and vague. He seemed distracted, preoccupied with something he would not share. Then, Galina noticed something that troubled her more deeply. Leonid had always been careful with money. They both had to be, living on her factory wages and his modest student stipend. But one evening, she saw him come home, carrying a bag from one of the better state shops, the kind that sold higher quality goods at prices most people could not afford. When she asked what he had bought, he showed her a new pair of leather shoes, well-made and expensive. He said he had saved up for them, that he had been putting aside a little money each month. It was plausible, but something about the way he said it made her uneasy. Over the summer, there were other things. In July, she noticed a new leather briefcase in his room, the kind professors carried, far nicer than the worn canvas bag he usually used. In August, he came home with a thick wool sweater, dark blue and well-tailored, that must have cost at least 30 rubles. When she asked where he had gotten the money, he told her he had been doing some extra work, helping a professor with research over the summer and cataloging materials in the university archives. It was the kind of job students sometimes got, and Galina wanted to believe him. But the frequency of these purchases began to worry her. A new fountain pen, a leather-bound notebook, a heavy winter coat that looked like it had never been worn before, still crisp and new when he brought it home. Leonid was not flaunting his newfound wealth. In fact, he seemed to be trying to hide it. He kept the new items in his room, wore the old clothes when he was around the apartment, and only brought out the nicer things when he thought she was not paying attention. But Galina noticed everything. She had always been observant, attuned to the rhythms of her small household, and the changes in Leonid's behavior weighed on her mind. In the fall of 1978, her concern had deepened into something closer to fear. She began to imagine scenarios, each one worse than the last. Perhaps Leonid had fallen in with a bad crowd, students who dealt in black market goods or engaged in petty theft. Perhaps he had borrowed money from someone dangerous and was now in debt. Perhaps he had become involved in something illegal, something that could bring shame to their family, or worse, attract the attention of the authorities. The Soviet Union was full of stories about young people who had made foolish mistakes and paid dearly for them. Galina did not want her son to become one of those stories. She tried to talk to him several times, asking gentle questions about his life, his friends, his studies. But Leonid deflected every attempt. He assured her that everything was fine, that he was simply busy with schoolwork, that there was nothing to worry about. His tone was patient but distant, and Galina could feel the wall he had built between them. She told herself that he was 21 years old, a grown man, and that she needed to respect his privacy. But the worry gnawed at her, especially late at night, when she lay awake in the dark, listening to the sounds of the buildings settling around her. The turning point came on the afternoon of November 3rd, 1978. Galina had the day off from the factory, a rare occurrence, and Leonid had left for campus early that morning, saying he had lectures until late in the evening. She spent the morning cleaning the apartment, washing dishes, sweeping floors, but by noon she found herself standing outside Leonid's closed bedroom door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never searched his room before. In all the years he had lived at home, she had respected his privacy, treating his space as his own. But the accumulation of small worries, the unanswered questions, the sense that something was deeply wrong, all of it pushed her forward. She told herself she was being a responsible parent, that she had a right to know if her son was in trouble. She turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was small and cluttered, with a narrow bed pushed against one wall and a desk piled high with textbooks and papers. She started with the desk, opening drawers and flipping through notebooks. She found lecture notes, essays marked with grades, a few letters from old school friends who had moved to other cities. Nothing unusual. But when she moved to the wardrobe and began searching through his clothes, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled open the drawers, she found what she had been dreading. Hidden beneath a stack of folded shirts, wrapped in a plain handkerchief, was a thick bundle of cash. Galina pulled it out and stared at it, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. There were rubles, neatly stacked and bound with a rubber band, far more than a university student should possess. She counted quickly, her fingers fumbling. Over 400 rubles, more than she earned in 3 months at the factory. She sat down on the edge of Leonid's bed, the money still in her hands, and felt the world tilt beneath her. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, trying to make sense of what she had found. She considered every possible explanation. Perhaps Leonid had been saving for years, hoarding every kopeck, but that did not explain the new clothes, the briefcase, the shoes. Perhaps he had won money somehow, though gambling was illegal and Leonid had never shown any interest in it. Perhaps someone had given it to him. But who? And why? The more she thought about it, the more her mind circled back to the darkest possibilities, that her son was involved in something criminal, something that could destroy his future. When Leonid came home that evening just after 8 o'clock, Galina was waiting for him in the kitchen. She had rehearsed what she would say, but when she saw him walk through the door, his face tired and unsuspecting, the words caught in her throat. She forced herself to speak. She told him to sit down, and then she placed the bundle of money on the table between them. Leonid's face went pale. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Galina could see the panic in his eyes, the rapid calculations as he tried to decide what to say. Then he started to deny it. He said the money was not his, that he was holding it for a friend. He said he had been saving it, that he had been doing extra work she did not know about. His explanations tumbled out one after another, each one contradicting the last, and Galina realized he was lying. She pressed him harder, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. She told him she had seen the new clothes, the briefcase, the shoes. She told him she knew something was wrong, that he needed to tell her the truth. And finally, after nearly an hour of evasion and half-truths, Leonid broke. He leaned back in his chair, his hands covering his face, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told her the money had come from a friend at the university, a graduate student named Oleg Petrov. Oleg was older, 26 or 27, and he had a reputation on campus as someone who was well-connected, who always seemed to have money and resources that others lacked. Leonid had met him during a seminar, and they had become friendly. Oleg had been charming, intelligent, and persuasive, and he had gradually drawn Leonid into his confidence. Sometime later, Leonid could not remember the exact date, Oleg had approached him with a proposition. He needed help, he said, with a project. The details were vague, but Oleg explained that he was distributing certain materials on campus, writings and essays that presented alternative perspectives on Soviet history and politics. Some of these materials were critical of the party, some questioned official narratives, and some were translations of works by Western authors or Soviet dissidents who had been exiled or imprisoned. Oleg needed someone to help him place these materials in locations where students would find them. Library reading rooms, common areas, dormitory lounges. It was not dangerous, Oleg had assured him. It was simply a way of encouraging critical thinking, of exposing students to ideas they would not encounter in official lectures, and he would pay Leonid for his help. Not a fortune, but enough to make a difference. 20 rubles here, 40 rubles there, depending on the task. For a university student living on a tight budget, it was a substantial sum. Leonid had hesitated at first, but Oleg had been persuasive. He had framed it as an intellectual exercise, a way of fostering genuine discussion and debate. He had spoken eloquently about the importance of questioning authority, of seeking truth beyond propaganda. And Leonid, who had always been curious and thoughtful, had found himself drawn in. He told himself it was harmless, that he was simply helping distribute reading materials, that no one was being hurt. And the money made it easier to justify. Galina listened to all of this with growing unease. She asked Leonid where Oleg had gotten these materials, and Leonid admitted he did not know. He had asked once, and Oleg had been evasive, saying only that he had connections, that he knew people who could get things that were not easily available. Leonid had assumed it was some kind of underground network, perhaps connected to dissident circles in Moscow or Leningrad. He had not pressed the issue, but then, in late October, something had changed. Oleg had become more cautious, more secretive. He had started meeting Leonid in different locations, away from campus, and he had warned Leonid to be careful, to avoid drawing attention. And one evening, during a conversation in a quiet park near the Neva River, Oleg had let something slip. He had mentioned contacts, people who supported his work, and when Leonid had asked who these people were, Oleg had smiled and said only that they were friends from the West, that they believed Soviet students deserved access to information their government denied them. Leonid had felt a chill run through him. Friends from the West. He had not asked Oleg to elaborate, but the implication was clear. Oleg was not just distributing dissident literature, he was working with foreigners, possibly with Western intelligence agencies, to spread propaganda on Soviet soil. And Leonid, by helping him, had become part of it. Galina sat in stunned silence as Leonid finished speaking. Her mind was reeling. This was not black market trading. This was not petty theft. This was something far more serious. Her son had been recruited, however unwittingly, into what could be construed as a foreign intelligence operation. He had been paid by people with connections to the West to undermine Soviet ideology, to corrupt other students, to betray his country. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Leonid was not a spy. She knew that. He was a foolish boy who had been seduced by money and the thrill of doing something forbidden. He had not understood the gravity of what he was involved in, had not realized that the person he called a friend was using him as a tool in a much larger game. But ignorance would not protect him. If the authorities found out, when they found out, Leonid would be arrested, tried, and punished. And the punishment for treason, even for someone who had been manipulated, was severe. Leonid seemed to understand this now. As he sat across from her, his face pale and his hands shaking, he looked like a frightened child. He told her he had been planning to stop, that he had not taken any money from Oleg in over a week, that he knew he had made a terrible mistake. He begged her not to tell anyone, to let him handle it quietly, to give him a chance to disappear from Oleg's life and hope that nothing came of it. But Galina could not think clearly. Her mind was a storm of fear, anger, and confusion. She told Leonid to go to his room, and he obeyed without a word, retreating like a scolded child. She sat alone in the kitchen for hours, staring at the bundle of money on the table, trying to decide what to do. Part of her wanted to protect Leonid, to find a way to shield him from the consequences of his actions. But another part of her, the part that had been shaped by decades of Soviet education, by propaganda posters and party meetings and speeches about vigilance, told her that this was bigger than her personal feelings. Leonid had been compromised. He had been drawn into something that threatened the state, and if she did nothing, if she tried to hide it, she would become complicit. Worse, if the authorities discovered Leonid's involvement on their own, they would assume she had known and said nothing. She could be arrested as an accomplice, but there was something else, something deeper that drove her thinking. Galina genuinely believed in the Soviet system. She believed that it was just, that it existed to protect its citizens, that it would show mercy to those who had been led astray. She had spent her entire life trusting that the party knew best, that the state cared for its people, that obedience and loyalty would be rewarded. And she believed, with a faith that bordered on desperation, that if she reported Leonid herself, If she demonstrated her own loyalty and her son's willingness to confess, the authorities would be lenient. They would see that Leonid was young, that he had been manipulated, that he deserved a second chance. They would re-educate him, perhaps send him to a labor camp for a year or two. But eventually, he would be allowed to return. He would be reformed, corrected, made into a better Soviet citizen. She told herself this over and over as the night wore on. She paced the small apartment, moving from the kitchen to the living room and back again, her mind circling the same thoughts. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would report Leonid to the KGB. She would do it out of love, out of a belief that the system would help him, out of a conviction that this was the only way to save her son from a fate far worse than anything the state would impose. On the morning of November 4th, 1978, Galina dressed carefully in her best clothes, a plain grey dress, clean and pressed, and a wool coat that she reserved for special occasions. She told Leonid she was going to run errands, and he nodded without looking at her, his face drawn and exhausted. She left the apartment just after 9 o'clock and walked through the cold streets toward the KGB office. The building was located in a quiet part of the city, unremarkable from the outside, with no sign to indicate what it was. Galina had passed it countless times over the years, but had never paid it much attention. Now, as she approached the entrance, she felt her heart hammering in her chest. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and took a deep breath. Then she stepped inside. The interior was stark and cold, with bare walls and fluorescent lights that cast everything in a harsh, clinical glow. A uniformed guard sat behind a desk near the entrance, and he looked up as she entered. Galina approached him, her voice trembling slightly, and said she needed to report a matter of state security. The guard studied her for a moment, then picked up a phone and made a brief call. He told her to wait. 20 minutes later, a man in a dark suit appeared and led her down a narrow hallway to a small office. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Sokolov, though Galina suspected this was not his real name. He gestured for her to sit, and she lowered herself into a hard wooden chair across from his desk. He asked her to explain why she was there, and Galina, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, began to speak. She told him everything and handed over all of the money she had found. She spoke about the conversation with Leonid, the friend named Oleg Petrov, and the materials they had been distributing. She explained that Leonid had been paid, that he had not understood the full implications of what he was doing, that he had been manipulated by someone with connections to foreign elements. She emphasized that Leonid was young, that he had made a mistake, that he was genuinely remorseful and willing to cooperate. She asked, her voice breaking slightly, whether there was any way the authorities could show leniency, whether Leonid could be given a chance to prove his loyalty. Lieutenant Sokolov listened without expression, taking notes in a small leather-bound notebook. When she finished, he asked a few clarifying questions: Leonid's full name, his date of birth, where he studied, where Oleg could be found. Galina answered as best she could, though she realized she knew very little about Oleg beyond what Leonid had told her. When the questioning was over, Lieutenant Sokolov closed his notebook and told her to go home. He said someone would be in touch, that she should say nothing to anyone about this conversation, and that she had done the right thing by coming forward. His tone was neutral, neither reassuring nor threatening, and Galina left the office feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. She walked home slowly, her legs unsteady, and when she arrived back at the apartment, she found Leonid sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, their eyes met. She saw the question in his face, but she could not bring herself to answer. She turned away and went to her room, closing the door behind her. 2 days later, on the morning of November 6, 1978, officers from the KGB and city militia came for Leonid. Galina was at work when it happened, operating her machine in the noisy, overheated factory. She did not learn about the arrest until she came home that evening and found the apartment empty. A neighbor, a woman named Vera Ivanovna, who lived 2 doors down, stopped her in the hallway and told her what she had seen. 3 men in dark coats, accompanied by men from the militia, had arrived just after 10 o'clock. They had knocked on the door, and when Leonid answered, they had identified themselves and taken him away. Vera said Leonid had not resisted, had not said a word, had simply walked between the men as they escorted him to a waiting car. Galina stood in the hallway, frozen, as Vera spoke. When the neighbor finished, Galina thanked her in a voice that did not sound like her own and went into the apartment. She moved through the rooms mechanically, turning on lights, checking Leonid's bedroom. Everything was as he had left it. His bed unmade, books stacked on the desk, the wardrobe door slightly ajar. She sat down on his bed and stared at the wall, unable to think, unable to feel anything but a vast, hollow emptiness. Within hours, the KGB had also arrested Oleg Petrov. Galina would learn later, through fragments of information that trickled out over the following weeks, that Leonid had provided Oleg's name and details during his initial interrogation. The speed with which the arrests occurred suggested that the authorities had been efficient, methodical, and thorough. What followed was a process that took place entirely out of Galina's sight. Leonid and Oleg were held in separate detention facilities, interrogated by teams of officers, and subjected to questioning that lasted days. The exact details of what happened during those interrogations remain unclear, but based on accounts that emerged years later from other cases, it is likely that both young men were pressured to confess, to provide names of others involved, to detail every meeting, every conversation, every piece of material they had distributed. What is known is that the investigation had actually been underway for some time before Galina's report. The KGB's 5th Chief Directorate, which handled ideological crimes and dissident activity, had been monitoring certain students at Leningrad State University for months, concerned about the circulation of unauthorized materials on campus. Oleg Petrov had been under surveillance since at least the summer of 1978, though investigators had not yet gathered enough evidence to move forward with arrests. Galina's report provided the final pieces they needed: confirmation of the distribution network, details about payments, and most critically, the names of specific individuals involved. Oleg, it seems, broke quickly under interrogation. According to sources that surfaced long after the Soviet Union's collapse, Oleg confirmed that he had been in contact with individuals connected to American intelligence, though the exact nature of these contacts remained murky even in official files. Some accounts suggest he had been recruited through an intermediary during a foreign academic conference in 1977, while others claim he had been approached by someone posing as a Western journalist who visited Leningrad that same year. What became clear during the investigation was that Oleg had been receiving regular payments, that he had been distributing materials designed to promote Western ideologies and undermine Soviet authority, and that he had recruited Leonid to assist him, likely identifying the younger student as someone vulnerable to persuasion and in need of money. For the Soviet authorities, this was not a minor matter. The period was marked by intense Cold War tensions, and the KGB was under constant pressure to root out foreign espionage operations and prevent ideological subversion. University campuses, where young people were exposed to new ideas and where foreign students and professors sometimes circulated, were considered high-risk environments. The discovery of what appeared to be a Western-funded propaganda operation at Leningrad State University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the Soviet Union, was seen as a serious security breach that demanded a strong response. Initially, both Leonid and Oleg were charged under Article 70 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, which dealt with anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. This charge carried serious penalties, including lengthy prison sentences, but it did not automatically warrant the death penalty. However, as the investigation progressed and interrogators pressed Oleg for more details about his foreign contacts, the case was reclassified. By mid-December 1978, the charges against both young men had been elevated to Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code: treason. The reclassification appears to have been driven by political considerations as much as legal ones. The authorities wanted to send a message, to make an example that would deter other students from engaging in similar activities. The trial, if it could be called that, took place in a closed tribunal sometime in late January 1979. There was no public announcement, no opportunity for family members to attend, and no defense counsel willing to challenge the charges. The proceedings were brief and perfunctory, the outcome predetermined. Both Leonid and Oleg were found guilty of treason against the Soviet state and sentenced to death by firing squad. On February 14, 1979, Valentine's Day in the West, though the date held no significance in the Soviet Union, Leonid Pyotrovich Volkov was executed. Oleg Vladimirovich Petrov was executed the same day, at the same location, which was almost certainly a military facility on the outskirts of Leningrad. The executions were carried out in secret, with no witnesses beyond the personnel required to be present. The bodies were transferred to MVD custody and buried in an undisclosed location, likely an unmarked plot in a restricted area where executed prisoners were routinely interred. No records were kept of the exact burial sites, and families were never informed of where their loved ones had been laid to rest. Galina learned of her son's death several weeks after it occurred. In March 1979, a KGB officer appeared at her door late one evening. He handed her a brief official notice, typed on thin paper and stamped with an official seal. The notice stated that Leonid Volkov had been found guilty of crimes against the Soviet state under Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, and that the sentence had been carried out in accordance with Soviet law. It provided no details about the trial, no information about the execution date, and no indication of where Leonid was buried. The officer told her that the matter was classified, that she was not to speak about it publicly, and that any further inquiries would be considered suspicious. Then he left. Galina stood in the doorway, the notice still in her hand, and felt something inside her shatter. The son she had tried to save was dead. The system she had trusted had killed him. And as the hours passed, and the reality of what had happened began to sink in, she realized that her faith, her loyalty, her belief that the state would be merciful, all of it had been a lie she had told herself. But the worst was yet to come. Within days, Galina discovered that her role in Leonid's arrest had become public knowledge. It is unclear exactly how the information spread, whether someone had seen her enter the KGB office, whether the story had leaked through unofficial channels, or whether the KGB itself had quietly let it be known that Leonid's own mother had reported him. In Soviet society, where neighbors watched neighbors and everyone lived in close quarters, secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Galina's neighbors, people she had lived alongside for nearly 20 years, began to avoid her. Vera Ivanovna, who had always been friendly, now turned away when they passed in the hallway. The couple downstairs, who had sometimes invited her for tea, stopped acknowledging her existence. One morning, Galina found a pile of garbage left outside her apartment door. At the factory, the ostracism was even worse. Her co-workers, who had once chatted with her during breaks and included her in their conversations, now fell silent when she approached. During lunch, she sat alone at the end of a long table, and no one met her eyes. Her supervisor stopped assigning her to group tasks, isolating her at a machine in the corner of the factory floor where she could work without interacting with anyone. The trade union committee, which she had been part of for years, quietly removed her from the roster without explanation. But the most devastating blow came from her own family. Galina had a younger brother, Anatoly, who lived in Moscow with his wife and 3 children. When he learned what had happened, and Galina never discovered how he found out, he sent her a brief, cold letter. In it, he wrote that he could not comprehend how she had betrayed her own flesh and blood, that he wanted nothing to do with her, and that she should never contact him or his family again. The letter ended with a single line: "You chose the state over your son. May you live with that choice." Galina tried at first to explain herself. She told anyone who would listen that she had acted out of love, that she had believed the authorities would help Leonid, that she had never imagined the outcome would be so terrible. But no one cared. To them, she was a woman who had sent her son to his death, and no justification could erase that fact. In a society where informing was both encouraged and despised, where the state relied on citizens reporting each other, but everyone hated those who did, Galina had committed the ultimate betrayal. She had informed on her own child. Over the following months, Galina withdrew into herself. She stopped attending the factory social events she had once enjoyed, stopped going to party meetings, stopped participating in the life of her building. She went to work each morning, operated her machine in silence, and came home each evening to an empty apartment. She cooked simple meals for one, ate without tasting the food, and spent her evenings sitting in the dark, staring at the walls. Galina's health began to deteriorate. She lost weight rapidly, her face becoming gaunt and hollow, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. She developed a persistent cough that grew worse over the weeks, and colleagues at the factory noticed that she moved more slowly, as if every step required immense effort. She took no sick days, perhaps because work was the only routine she had left, the only reason to leave the apartment each morning. But her decline was visible to anyone who looked. In late July, Galina collapsed at her machine. She was taken to a hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with severe pneumonia and acute malnutrition. She spent 3 weeks in a ward, lying in a narrow bed surrounded by other sick and dying patients. During that entire time, not a single person came to visit her. No co-workers, no neighbors, no family. The nurses treated her with clinical efficiency, but there was no warmth, no compassion. When she was finally discharged, she returned to her apartment and tried to resume her life. But something fundamental had broken inside her. Galina died alone sometime in September 1979. The exact date remains unknown. She was found in her apartment after failing to report to work for several days. She was lying on the floor of the small kitchen where she had once prepared meals for her family. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure, secondary to exhaustion and chronic illness, but those who had known her believed she had simply given up. She was nearly 52 years old. Her funeral was arranged by the state, as was standard for all Soviet citizens who died without family to claim them. The service was brief, and sparsely attended, no family, mostly distant acquaintances who felt obligated to appear. There were no flowers, no eulogies, and no tears. Galina Volkova was buried in an unmarked grave in a public cemetery on the outskirts of Leningrad, her name added to a ledger that would eventually be lost in the chaos of the Soviet Union's collapse. The case of Leonid Volkov and Oleg Petrov was never publicly acknowledged by the Soviet government. The KGB's files on the matter remained sealed in what later became the FSB archives, and even after the Soviet Union fell in 1991, many documents related to the Cold War period remained classified. What little is known about the case comes from whispers among former university students, brief mentions in memoirs published during the more open atmosphere of the 1990s, and oral histories collected by researchers documenting Soviet-era repression. The apartment building where Galina and Leonid lived still stands today in St. Petersburg. The grey concrete tower looks much as it did in 1978, weathered but still functional, still housing families who know nothing of what happened there. Galina's grave lies unmarked in a cemetery that has been expanded over the decades, and no one visits. Leonid's burial site remains unknown, his body likely interred in an unmarked mass grave that may have been built over long ago. Their story is one of thousands from that era. Families destroyed by the machinery of the Soviet state, lives sacrificed to an ideology that promised justice but delivered only cruelty. Galina had been a true believer who discovered too late that the system she trusted cared nothing for her or her son. She had acted out of faith, and that faith had destroyed everything she loved. In the end, both mother and son became casualties of a system that demanded absolute loyalty and showed no mercy to those who failed to understand that loyalty was never enough.